Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumburger channel, a strange show that looks at a different album each and every week. So by now, autumn has probably come and gone, but today we're gonna return to autumn by looking at a remastered album that acts as a somewhat abstract examination of the season, if that makes sense. So this review, it's actually not one I was expecting to write at all, but an odd incident a few weeks ago occurred, resulting in me needing to distract myself from turmoil, resulting in me writing about this very album that we're going to look at today. To be fair, I have wanted to cover the music of Lawrence English for quite some time on this channel before. We have dived a lot into his record label Room 40 so far, so I've always wanted to discuss some of his own work, but I didn't think this was going to be the one I'd land on first, but an odd set of circumstances resulted in this very review we have today. But yeah, it's a bit odd, but a genuinely beautiful album, one I'm very excited to discuss today. So today I present A Colour for Autumn by Lawrence English. And so, of course, we need to ask ourselves, who is Lawrence English? Well, Lawrence English is an Australian composer, artist and curator, founder and owner of the fascinating label Room 40, who, as I've mentioned, we've covered a couple of times on the channel by now, so far. So, English's own work into composition, it tends to offer incredibly large, expansive sounds that try to fill your entire body up. Though within it there are the occasional gentle ambient album as well from time to time. So what is A Colour for Autumn then? Well, this was originally an album from 2009, released on Taylor Deupree's wonderful record label 12K, of course. 15 years later though, English has returned to this album with a lovingly delicate remaster from one Stephen Matteo, who we actually covered in our very poorly written and poorly presented fourth episode of Weird Music, actually, when we reviewed A Static Place Remain. Anyway, Matteo's treatment to the album, it really helps to elevate so many of the little nuances embedded in these recordings, giving it such fresh life after all of these years. A fascinating, beautiful album. So let's discuss it then, shall we? So, immediately, with Droplet, you get drones, vocals, a ghostly quality that instantly starts to transport you into that state of existential bewilderment. There's just something amazingly breathtaking about the way this track all starts off, like an ambient drone of the tiniest fragment of a pop song maybe, stretched out into infinity. The intertwining nature of the drones themselves feel very effortless into the mix, accompanied by the vocals, which were provided by, sadly, the late Dean Roberts, who's just basically vocally hums throughout the composition, a variety of various hums. It results in a beautifully lovely opener that places us in this rather cold autumnal landscape. And the new mixing on it sounds so wonderful as well, though, really helping to bring to life the wonderful track that, I'll be honest, it kind of flew a bit past me when I first heard this on the original album. I do think it's a lovely existential moment of just pondering the very landscape you're seeing and letting its multitude of details all come in at their own pace as the music drifts on past like the wind itself. A perfect scene setter that builds and builds from its opening before letting everything fall back into these longer stretches of time, really pulling you down into those tiny minute details as the world drifts past. There's something so pretty, so beautiful and so incredibly melancholy about this track, and it's just a brilliant way to open up the entirety of this album. So the next track, Watching It Unfold, easily one of my favourite tracks of this entire album, and one that always stood out to me when I first heard it on the original. So opening up with a deluge of high-pitched frequencies echoing across the landscape, it sort of adds this sort of sense of tension almost, before we're then greeted by the saddest and loveliest motif of 3 single descending piano notes. And this piano just loops, playing that same brief little melody of sort as all around in the background drones just build up, rising and ebbing with their tones and frequencies, and sometimes occupying these lower registers that drag the composition down before showcasing high-pitched frequencies that rise up out from the ashes. I love as well how towards the end, after a few cycles of these loops and drones, you get what sounds like a rising presence of brass instruments maybe, just gently pulling on these incredibly somber notes. It all results in an incredibly slow and patient track, but there's something so beautiful about the way it presents itself, perfectly capturing a sense of the orange hues that you get in the autumnal months. There is a sense of coldness, of course, but also the beauty of it too as well. And this is genuinely a track that just leaves me feeling so existential, just so lost in my own thoughts as I just let myself wander around them, mostly remembering being stood upon hills watching the sun go down at dusk. The colours blending in the sky in such a fascinating and unique way that's maybe impossible to describe. It's, without a doubt, one of the most beautiful tracks off this album, and every time I hear it, it just leaves me completely speechless. The next track of the Prelude II. So this one feels a lot more minimalist in some respects, considering, this alternative drone between 2 notes, a rise and a descent backed up by a myriad of different effects, tones and drones. And it feels to me like a very delicate track, I have to say. One that is rather brief in amount in terms of this track listing, I should add, acting most likely as a precursor for the next track. You kind of get this gentle melancholy ambient drift to establish the scene, and its structure is one that feels very distinctly ambient. But I love English's treatment of it all, just giving the composition little flares here and there, following those rise and ebbs to create this incredibly gentle passage that steeped in this emotional resonance. Something about the particulars of the drones themselves, the notes they pull on for however long they do, just creates this beautifully resounding music that sounds so wonderfully emotional. It's what I adore about ambient music, as you might as well know by now. But of course, the Prelude II leads the way into the next track of The Surface of Everything. Beautiful low-end drones establishing the setting as we're greeted with the rising rumbles of ambient swells and faint acoustic notes resonating in the space. So, just to quickly mention, this song also features a collaborator, the one and only Luís Fernandes, who contributes electronics to this recording. And so I love his presence in this one as well. Really helps to add to sort of the colouring of the autumnal palette, and it kind of gives me the sense of a close-up examination of those very minute details of all that the season entails, as you sort of rummage your hands through the very foliage itself, And I adore in this one that gentle pulling and letting go quality that the music has, kind of swelling up with these gentle drones before releasing it all with a twang of more acoustic notes on the guitar, I think, before being brought right back to the central position with another ambient swell. And I adore the kind of character that this little gentle presence the acoustic notes have, that they bring to the composition, as it continues much in the same vein of the previous tracks of bringing in rising ambient drones of various tones. It once again adds to the incredible melancholy landscape, as the whole album's been offering up to us on this entire album experience thus far, one that's so oddly introspective with its details. And I'm not sure why, but this track feels a little bit like a focal point for the entire album, one that seems to rise with that cold warmth that only autumnal days can offer. To explain it better, the way in which autumn is generally a rather cold season, but it's one that is abundant in this beautiful tapestry of colours though. It's perhaps amongst my favourite seasons, of course. Not that we really have seasons in the conventional sense anymore, of course, but, it is what it is, and it's just what my mind is drawn to when hearing this particular track, so thought I might as well mention it. But essentially, it's another beautiful track on an absurdly beautiful album, isn't it? Moving along, we glide straight into the following track of Galaxies of Dust. And this one really indulges in the drones as certain notes are held onto for such wonderfully long passages of time. And it feels like a further stretching of everything that's preceded this very point on the album. A sense of taking all of those motifs, those tones, the textures, and just dragging them out and holding them onto such beautifully long times, before opening up into a new landscape with the presence of a sort of electronic, brassy percussion type thing, maybe, backed up by the wonderful swells of assumedly brass instruments, of course. Or maybe just generated tones that sound like it. It's actually hard to discern what, to be fair, but is what it is. I do love, though, that the sort of long-form drones that have opened up this track, they've kind of morphed into this entirely different landscape, one that has changed as the very leaves fall from the trees and turn to their incredible varying shades of browns, reds and yellows. I think for me, it really imparts once again that incredible wistful existential quality that only ambient music like this can offer. The idea of staring out into the very vastness of it all, taking it all in right there and then. And especially for me, in terms of extrapolating upon that very imagery, the season of autumn, and how it brings with it such a beautiful myriad of colours, browns, yellows, reds, pinks. I'll say here, but it's perhaps always been one of my favourite seasons. And listening to this little tribute to the season, it's just a beautiful contradictory thing of being so lovely and so sad at the same time. And I think it might be sort of due in part to how the changing climate, something English mentions in the very liner notes for this very album, how it calls back to an older time when the years were made up by these seasons, and how these days it's not so much of a thing anymore, especially with climate change. The weather is, vastly different year to year, and you no longer get spring, summer, autumn, winter in the conventional sense, but kind of this completely blended in version that lasts an entire year now. It's a bit odd, it's a bit difficult to explain, and it's kind of weird for me as well, because whenever I'm at work and the conversation of the weather comes up, I often bring up the fact that, they taught us seasons in school, but now they don't exist anymore. To consider it all, though, I think it's perhaps one of the very elements that this very album is trying to capture, though, the sort of sense of loss of these seasons almost. And I feel like, to consider it all, it kind of leans more heavily onto the rather melancholy aspect of this record. The sadness of it all, but also the incredible beauty within it as well. Strange, but something I thought worth mentioning. So, moving along, we get the penultimate track of Stillness in Motion, another opener of rising drones and swells that slowly colour the scene with that autumnal palette before letting the accompanying swells join the scene as they add to the sound. Once again, all kind of minimal, really letting the notes just hold on for as long as they need to before they drone away, before incredibly faint motifs join the scene, dragging it down into these rather expressive and melancholy depths. It's patient, gentle, ambient music, of course, but it's the kind that just gets my mind thinking over and over, mostly in regards to those autumnal months. I like, though, how it just slowly pushes itself along, leaving behind these incredible streaks of orange and browns, as though the very sky is intertwining its many colours in a beautiful tapestry. And I love how we're approaching the end of the album by this point, and it's continuing to present this rather existential and melancholy outlook. Especially in terms of how the music just sounds to me, Everything just sounds so incredibly still, just hovering in the very air itself before it all fades away into a peculiar moment midway through the track, giving us a singular frequency that hangs still within the air itself, before being accompanied by those soft pads and ambient drones. I adore how gentle, still and patient this track is, and how beautifully it just continues the story of this very album up to its ending in the next track. Speaking of, we get the final track, And Clouds for Company, which I think is a really beautiful name for a track that has and just gives it a lovely final notion to end everything on. And much like the thoughts of standing still, taking in the vast openness of the world itself, staring at the skies in existential longing, this one pushes out some peculiar frequencies, still minimal for the most part, but really taking their time to establish the gentle scene to close everything off. And it's like, after everything we've heard and experienced on this album, all that's left to do is just take in our surroundings as we stand alone into the world, looking towards the sky with only clouds for company, watching the many shapes take form in this rather abstract way. It's a final existential note to finish it all, and it presents itself with that further wistful questioning of everything. It feels, as you just get gentle glides to close, to sort of close everything else as ambient drones fall in and out with almost randomness, it seems. And considering the album starts off, I would argue rather intensely with the opening track. It feels like it's all regressed into the barest of details here, leaving everything on a very quiet final note, just giving us enough to consider it all. A beautiful way to end this album. And so, it's a bit of a tricky one to summarise, I feel. A lot of what I feel I've already mentioned, just that sense of the autumnal seasons and all their beauty, which now come across in a rather bittersweet way in consideration to the current climate of the world. It's the beauty of ambient music, though, the expression of rather abstract concepts and ideas through the form of instrumental music. And I think this album does a beautiful job expressing these rather abstract notions, and it just leaves my heart pining over the beauty of the world that does exist all around us if we only pause to take in the details. And I say this as someone who is genuinely, constantly distracted and unaware of it all for the most part, that the vast majority of the time I'm just plodding along, going along one day at a time, but I think something that so many of us have in common are just those brief instances where the beauty of the world just takes a hold of you, and you stare out at it, taking it all in, and just considering how amazing it is to exist in that singular moment. And so I think, out of the many albums English has produced, this is perhaps one of his finest in the entire discography. It's perhaps arguably a little bit off the beaten track for what I'm used to from him. English's discography is one that's rather varied, indeed, but the part I've delved into, I would argue, is kind of like the more Tim Hecker side of things, of creating rather maximalist, almost harsh tones that get under your skin in this terrifying yet spectacular way. To see English, though, really holding back and delving into more minimalist notions on this particular record really showcases such an incredible creativity, as well as a really delicate, approach in terms of music composition, when it is needed in particular, of course. For me, it results in music that I just find to be so incredibly emotionally comforting as it leaves me existentially musing the state of the world. And so to further explore that notion before we close off, but to return back to the brief mentioning of how this review came about, so Glumburger story time. It was earlier this year that I went to a wedding reception for a cousin of my partner's. So everything was fine on the journey. But when I arrived, found myself stuck in an incredibly small room with too many people I didn't know, with incredibly loud music there. And as a result, I became completely overwhelmed and suffered an incredibly deliberating panic attack that left me frozen in fear. So it'd been a really long time since I'd experienced a panic attack like this, and although it was a safe space in many respects, I just felt incredibly tense, anxious, and unable to relax. And after a couple of hours of experiencing this, it took heading outside and putting on this very album and writing my thoughts about it to ground myself back to reality. At the time, I was reminded of how often ambient music has come to save the day during these incredibly arduous moments. For example, during my 20s, when my anxiety and depression was at its worst, I would often play ambient music to help guide me through tumultuous situations, and in the recent experience of doing so kind of reminded me of the importance I hold in music, though. I'm sure that those of you out there who also suffer from anxiety and or panic attacks can no doubt relate and understand, especially if you've used music to help you as well. And as horrible as the experience was in my own head, I have been left with an incredible gratitude towards this very album, which helped to just comfort me and bring me back down to reality. It is the power of music sometimes, and maybe it doesn't make sense to some of you watching, but the point I'm trying to express is that, this is now my particular experience of this album. And even though there's this incredibly weighty melancholy attached to so much of it, I still find it incredibly comforting and calming. Just minimalism to help focus the mind during chaotic turbulence. A bit of an odd story, but to me, an interesting one that is now just tied to this very album for me. And this very review as well, of course, as even the writing my thoughts on the music helped you to guide me out of that chaos. Very peculiar existential moment I was experiencing at the time, but as a result, it resulted in the very review we have here today. And so I think with that, we will just come to the end of our episode of Weird Music there. Definitely a bit of an odd one to review, but my experience and story behind starting this very review was a very weird experience indeed. I feel very grateful that I was able to snag one of the many download codes that English shared for this album, as it meant I was able to hear this album when I most needed it. And regardless of that though, it is still an immensely beautiful album in so many respects, and easily one of the most gentle and delicate of all of English's releases. And considering my understanding of his music stems from the likes of Wilderness of Mirror, for example, rather intense and macabre ambient drone albums, to have something like this in his discography, is an incredibly strange, interesting, yet beautiful thing. And of course, so lovingly remastered for the 15-year anniversary of the very album. I can easily see why English is particularly proud of this one, because I certainly would be myself. So yeah, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best, take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.